1971, a 19-year-old Irishman named William began studying physics and computer science at a university in Belfast, Northern Ireland. While he was certainly smart enough to complete the 4-year degree, after 1 year of being in the school, he decided to drop out because he felt like this was not the path he wanted to be on. So he moved back home to a town about 30 minutes north of Belfast, where he got a job as a forklift driver and truck driver for the Guinness Beer Factory. And while he loved this job, he still felt like this was not the path for him. He needed to do something more with his life. And so he decided he would pursue what 2 of his siblings had gone on to do, which was to become a school teacher. He had always admired his school teachers growing up, and he idolized his 2 siblings that had become teachers, and so it felt like the right fit. And so William applied to a 4-year teaching college in Newcastle in England, and after he was accepted, he flew to England, he got set up, and then he began his studies. The first year was great. He loved what he was doing, he did feel like this is the right fit, and he was getting good grades, everything was going exactly to plan. But then year 2 happened and everything went off the rails. A requirement to graduate from this 4-year teaching college was all the aspiring teachers starting in their 2nd year had to go teach real students real lessons. They basically had to go to high schools and elementary schools and fill in for the real teacher and give a real lesson. And they were scored on their ability to do that. But all the aspiring teachers knew that when you gave these real lessons to real students, what really ended up happening was the students did not take the aspiring teachers seriously. They viewed them as kind of like substitute teachers, and so they didn't respect them and they didn't listen to them. And so typically these real teaching sessions just turned into the aspiring teachers desperately trying to calm down their pupils long enough to get them to listen to their lesson plan for just 1 second. But normally it didn't work out, and before long the day was over and nothing was really accomplished. So in William's 2nd year, when it was his turn to go over to a high school and administer his lesson plan, he went over there knowing what he was up against. He did not really expect it to go well. But he decided he would go in there with a positive attitude and he would try to do his best. But as soon as he walked into his classroom, he immediately could tell he was going to be overwhelmed. Everybody's standing up and talking amongst themselves, and they turn around and they see William walking in, and they have this moment of realization that their real teacher is not going to be teaching them that day. It's going to be this substitute, William, and they all kind of gleefully began laughing and joking, and they just turned their backs on William and kept talking amongst themselves. And so William goes inside, he puts his stuff on the desk, and he attempts to get the class to listen to him by saying, "Hey everyone, come on, sit down, time to listen up, I'm your new teacher for the day." But the kids just were not listening. And so finally, William, who was a really big guy, he was 6'4", he was in great shape, he kind of postured himself and then yelled at the class, "Sit down right now." And at this, the class did turn around and looked at William and kind of sized him up, and most of them decided, okay, it's time to sit down. And so 99% of the class goes quiet and sits down, except for one kid. It was this 15-year-old boy who was at the back of the room, and he was standing up, defiant, with his arms crossed, staring at William with a smirk on his face. And all around him, all his cronies were sitting down, looking up at him, laughing, and kind of looking up at William and laughing at him, knowing that a confrontation was about to ensue. And so William is staring at this kid, trying to get him to just sit without saying anything, and this kid is just mean mugging him with his arms crossed, and nothing's happening. And so William walks right up to him and kind of leans over his shoulder and says, "You need to go out in the hallway right now. I will meet you out there." And then William turned around and started walking back towards the front of the room, expecting this to have worked, that this 15-year-old kid would have just followed right along and he'd walk right out to the hallway and that would be that. But when he turned back around again, the 15-year-old kid had not moved. He was still standing in the back of the classroom, arms crossed, staring up at William, basically saying, "Make me." And at this, William lost his mind. He was so mad and so frustrated at how unbelievably disrespectful this kid was being, and really the whole class was being to him, that he just kind of lost it. And he ran up to this kid in the back of the room and he gets right up in his face. And remember, William is 6'4". He's a big guy. And he gets right in the kid's face and he's like, "Get out in the hall right now." And this kid doesn't flinch. Instead, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a knife, and he holds it right up against William. And William, without any hesitation, just winds up and blasts this kid across the side of the head, sending him flying over a kid sitting at a desk. He goes flying over this kid and crumples into the corner. And then when he stands up, he drops the knife and puts his hands up, and he's like, okay, I'll go out in the hall. And William's like, go out in the hall right now. And so the kid ran out of the classroom. He goes out into the hall, and the whole class is totally silent. No one even wants to look up at William. They're all kind of just looking down at their desk, trying to be as quiet as possible. And William walks back to the front of the class and proceeds to teach the rest of the lesson. As soon as the high school learned that this aspiring teacher, William, had basically knocked out one of their students, even though it seemed like it might have been a little bit deserved, they immediately told the teacher's college, and the teacher's college immediately expelled William. And so now William is suddenly jobless, and he's kind of lost again in the world. He doesn't know what he wants to do now because he really had committed to being a teacher. And so he goes back to his home in Northern Ireland, and he begins thinking about, what is he going to do next? And he keeps having this thought that he should pursue this thing that he's always been interested in, but he had never taken seriously because it felt so risky. But now that basically everything in his life had fallen apart, he had nothing to lose. So he decided, what the heck, I will do the thing that I've always wanted to do. And that was stage acting. And so he went and auditioned with a local theater company in Belfast. He was accepted into the theater troupe. And then 4 years later, he was discovered performing on stage by a Hollywood filmmaker. And they cast him in a movie, and the rest, as they say, is history. William Neeson, better known as Liam Neeson, would go on to star in dozens of huge movies and TV shows. And he's probably best known for his epic role in the movie Taken, where he is this CIA operative with a particular set of skills, and in this movie he punches a lot of people in the face, just like when he was a teacher. In 1963, when Tim Dick was just 10 years old, he went over to his friend's house and he snuck a bottle of whiskey from one of their shelves. He pulled it out and he poured himself a full glass to the brim with whiskey, and then he downed it in one huge gulp. Tim had grown up idolizing cowboys on TV, and every time he watched them, they would come galloping into some town, they would go into the saloon, and they would sit at the bar just throwing back shots of whiskey. And so Tim always assumed whiskey must be this totally amazing, refreshing drink for these guys to be drinking it out in the heat of the desert. But unfortunately for Tim, after he slugged this huge glass of whiskey, it was not refreshing. It tasted like gasoline, and his chest felt like it was on fire. But instead of being turned off by alcohol and waiting until he was older and of age to try it again, Tim instead thought, you know what, the next time I have whiskey, I just need to water it down a little bit. And so for the next year, Tim continued to periodically sneak whiskey out of his friends' cabinets, and he would drink this watered down whiskey. And then when he turned 11 years old, his father, who he was very close with, died tragically in a car accident. And Tim really didn't have a good way to cope with the grief of losing his father, and so he turned to drinking even more than he already was. And before long, Tim was like this young kid who basically was an alcoholic. But he hid it extremely well. He graduated high school, he graduated college, and really nobody knew he was drinking as much as he was. But after he graduated college and he was living on his own in Michigan, there was no structure in place or person in place to stop Tim from going overboard with his substance abuse. And so not only did his drinking get completely out of control, but he began using and selling drugs, namely cocaine. In 1978, when Tim was 25 years old, he and his drug dealing partner were scheduled to take part in the biggest drug deal of their careers. They would be selling about 1.5 pounds of cocaine to a guy named Michael Pfeiffer, and he'd be buying it for $42,000, which when you adjust that for inflation would be like buying it for $175,000 in 2021. Tim and his partner were very excited about all this money they were going to make, but they were equally worried about the transaction. A lot can go wrong. And so Tim decided, in order to mitigate their nerves and kind of make this a safer drug deal, he decided they would do the transaction inside of a public airport, because Tim had seen that done on TV and believed that would give them an additional layer of safety. And so on the day this deal is going to take place, Tim takes the 1.5 pounds of cocaine, he puts it inside of a brown Adidas gym bag, and he also throws a key lock inside of this bag. He zips it up, he walks outside, he dumps the bag in the back of his car, and he drives to the Kalamazoo International Airport in Michigan. When he gets there, he parks in the big parking lot right outside of the front doors, and as soon as he's parked, he goes around to the back of his car, he pulls out this brown Adidas bag, he throws it over his shoulder, shuts his trunk, and then he waits for his partner to show up. A couple of minutes later, right on time, his partner pulls into the lot, he parks nearby, and then the two of them very casually begin walking towards the front doors of this airport. They walk up the steps, they go in the front doors, and as soon as they're inside, they're looking around, and they find Michael Pfeiffer. He's standing up against the wall right in the area he had said he would be. And so without making any sort of contact with Michael, Tim and his partner turn the corner and they go into a nearby locker room. Once they're inside, Tim pulls the lock out of the brown bag, and then he puts the bag with the drugs in it inside of a locker. He shuts it and then uses the lock he had just pulled out to lock the locker. And then he and his partner leave the locker room. As soon as they go out into the main terminal, they start walking over towards Michael Pfeiffer. And as they get closer and closer, Tim's partner breaks off and goes to a bench on the other side of the terminal, and Tim continues walking on right up to Michael. And then when he reaches Michael, he very discreetly hands him the key to the lock on the locker, and he tells him which locker number the drugs are in. Michael doesn't say anything, he takes the key and he heads off to the locker room. Tim turns and he goes over to his partner and he sits down on the bench and waits. Meanwhile, Michael goes inside the locker room, he uses the key, he opens up the lock, he opens the locker up, he checks to make sure the drugs are still there. They are. As soon as that's confirmed, he takes the bag, he throws it over his shoulder, and he walks back out to the main terminal to meet up with Tim and his partner. Tim and his partner are sitting on the bench, they see Michael coming out of the locker room, and they're expecting Michael to walk over and basically hand them a bag full of $42,000. But instead, Michael walks up to them and draws a gun and points it at them and says, "I'm a police officer, you're under arrest." It would turn out this was a sting operation. Michael Pfeiffer, the undercover police officer, had been following around Tim and his partner for months. In Michigan at the time, if you were caught trying to sell 650 grams or more of cocaine, there was an automatic penalty of a life sentence. And Tim and his partner had just been arrested trying to sell more than 650 grams of cocaine. And so facing a life sentence, Tim took a deal that gave him a lesser sentence in exchange for information about other drug dealers. And so Tim would ultimately serve 2 years and 4 months in a federal penitentiary before he was released. Tim would say his time in prison was absolutely miserable, but it was necessary. It matured him in a major way, and it honed his sense of humor. Tim was always a very funny guy. He was always the class clown and the guy goofing around, but in prison, he found it a very difficult task to get these hardened prisoners and prison guards to laugh at his jokes. But eventually, with enough practice and repetition, he could get anybody in that prison to laugh at him. And so by the time he got out, he was like an amazing comedian. And so he decided, you know what, why don't I pursue a career in comedy? 4 years later, Tim Dick, better known as Tim Allen, landed the starring role on the hit TV show Home Improvement. And from there, he starred in dozens more movies and TV shows, but he's probably best known for his voice acting in the very popular movie series Toy Story, where he plays Buzz Lightyear. Today, Tim is sober and has been for decades. In 1964, during his final semester of college in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry decided to take an acting class. He believed it would be an easy A, and he'd always been pretty shy, and so he figured this class might be able to help him get over that. But this class wound up having a much larger impact on Harry's life than he ever could have imagined. Not only did he meet his future wife in this class, but he also realized he loved acting, something he never thought he would like, and he decided after college that that was the thing he was going to pursue. And so after he graduates later that year, he and his girlfriend get married, and then they fly out to Hollywood, California, where Harry auditions for Columbia Pictures' New Talent Program, which is basically this program that's designed to help new actors and actresses get parts in Hollywood because it's so hard to do that. And so he's accepted into this program, he signs a contract with them that pays him almost nothing, and right away they start shopping him around for different parts in TV shows and movies, but nobody is interested in Harry. Nobody. The only roles he was getting were incredibly minor and usually non-speaking, and so it was really not advancing his career. Then, in 1966, so 2 years after he and his wife had arrived in Hollywood, Harry received what seemed like his first big break. He was offered a speaking role in a movie, although it was a very minor role. It was a 60-second bit where Harry basically walked on screen in this hotel, and he started calling out for a particular guest, and when he finds this guest, he walks up and gives him a piece of paper paper, and then he leaves. So it's a forgettable scene, but it's a real scene in a real movie. And so this was a big deal for Harry. And so after Harry goes over to the studio and he films this whole scene and it's all done, he goes back over to the headquarters of the new talent program at Columbia Pictures. And as soon as he goes inside, one of the producers that was in charge of this new talent program, who had apparently had a chance already to see this 60-second scene in this movie that Harry was in, he calls Harry over and asks him to go up to his office for a second. And so the pair go up to his office, they both sit down, and the guy looks at him and says, "Look, I just gotta shoot you straight here. You're not gonna make it in Hollywood. You're not gonna be a movie star." When Tony Curtis was told to carry groceries across this room in one of his first movies, everybody knew right away as he's carrying those groceries that guy, he's going to be a movie star. You could see it in the scene, even though all he was doing was carrying groceries. And when you did your scene as the bellhop walking around the hotel, I just didn't see it. You don't have the X factor. You're not going to be a movie star. For reference, Tony Curtis, the guy this producer was referencing, was a huge movie star in the 1950s and 1960s. And so Harry, after getting this horrible comment made about him, he pauses for a second, and then he leans across the table and looks at this producer and squints his eyes and says, "You know, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star?" And at this totally smart aleck remark, the producer fired Harry on the spot. Harry would go on to sign a similar new talent program deal with Universal Studios, but again, he could not get a real part to save his life. And the feedback he finally got was, "Harry, you're just not pretty enough, and you're not really that talented." By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s, and while he still aspired to be an actor and wanted to be an actor, he was making almost no money from acting. And so he decided, instead of acting, he was going to become a carpenter. That was going to be his full-time job, despite the fact he knew nothing about carpentry. And so he literally, just because he has this interest in carpentry, goes to the library and checks out all these how to be a carpenter books. And over the next couple of weeks, he studies these books and does a couple projects around his own house. And then finally, he just felt confident enough, or he was just desperate enough for money, that he began going around to his network and asking people in Hollywood if they needed some woodworking, if they needed help from a carpenter. And surprisingly, lots of people took him up on his offer and they hired him to be their carpenter. And before long, Harry was dubbed the Carpenter to the Stars, which was kind of ironic because he actually was not a very good carpenter, and he was regularly seen on the job, literally holding a book, teaching him how to be a carpenter while doing the carpentry with his other hand. In 1976, Harry was a full-fledged carpenter and had been for about a year when one of his very close friends named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, gave him a call and told him he had a very unique opportunity for him. Now, at this point, Harry was not looking for any more acting roles. He kind of figured that that ship has sailed, even though he wishes he could be an actor. At this point, he had a wife, he had 2 sons, and so he's thinking, I gotta just keep doing this carpentry thing because I gotta pay the bills. So he says to Fred, I appreciate the offer of whatever this is, but if it has to do with acting, I'm just not interested. And Fred, who was one of the very few people in Hollywood who fundamentally believed Harry was destined to be a star, told Harry, no, this is different. This is not a pure go out and try out for the part and hope for the best. This is like put yourself in a good position and maybe somebody will discover you're as talented as you really are. And so Harry's like, okay, tell me about this opportunity, I'm interested. And so Fred explained there was this really talented and eccentric film director who was trying to cast an upcoming movie. And the way he went about casting for movies was a little bit strange. Instead of having each of the actors and actresses show up and individually audition for their parts, he would group batches of actors and actresses and he would have them audition as a group, because that way he could tell if there was chemistry amongst some of the actors and actresses, and he could gauge their individual talent. And so he had all these groups already planned out, but one of the groups was missing one male actor. Somebody had dropped out at the last minute and was not going to be there on the day of the audition. And so when Fred Roos heard through the grapevine that this director was going to be short this one person, he immediately reached out to the director and said, hey, I got your guy. There's this guy, Harry. He's done a little bit of acting. He's incredibly talented. You got to give him a chance. At the minimum, he can come in there and he can at least just read the lines and help you do this audition, but I know he's available that day and I know he would love to help. And so this director tells Fred, okay, thank you. I'd love to have him come down, but stress to him, he is not auditioning for any part in this movie. I'm not bringing in some person and just throwing them in. It takes me a long time to find people that I want to audition, and he is not one of them. He is just there to facilitate the audition. He's just going to read the lines so the other people in his group can do their audition. And so after Fred stopped explaining this situation, Harry was actually kind of annoyed. He was annoyed that Fred had basically already volunteered him, and so he couldn't really even say no without making Fred look bad. And he didn't like the idea that this was basically a waste of his time. He was being asked to go read lines, but not even try out. So how was this even an opportunity? But Fred told him, look, worst case scenario, you meet some pretty powerful people in Hollywood. This director's a big deal. The people there are going to be big deals in Hollywood. So you'll meet them and maybe they will recognize your talent. Or maybe you get some new clients for your carpentry business. So no matter what, you get something out of it. And so finally, Harry says, okay, fine, I'll go do this thing. And so Harry goes to this audition, he's handed the script, and he's reminded repeatedly to not attempt to audition. Don't try to act, just read the lines. I don't care if you're monotone, you just read these lines because you're not auditioning. Everybody else is, you're not. Is that clear? And Harry's like, yes, I get it. I'm just reading the lines. And so Harry sits down and he starts reading the lines and he's trying to do what they told him to do, but the way he was actually feeling and his actual personality began seeping through. He started coming off as this really grumpy and sarcastic guy that just didn't care about anybody there. He was just totally bitter that he was in the situation he was in. And apparently, this is exactly what the director was looking for in one of the characters he was trying to cast. That kind of nonchalant, bravado, macho, alpha type guy who just didn't care about anybody. And so over the course of the day, as he's reading the script over and over again, not caring at all about how he's performing, he's just simply reading these lines and just being himself, he was actually doing this amazing job portraying one of the characters. And so they let Harry go the whole day. No one told him they were looking at him as a potential character. And then at the end of the day, when Harry was about to just throw the script in the trash and leave without talking to anyone, the film director, better known as George Lucas, walks up to Harry, better known as Harrison Ford, and says, wait a minute, I was wrong. You are perfect for this movie, Star Wars. You need to play Han Solo. And so Harrison Ford said, all right, I'll play Han Solo. And that role as Han Solo propelled Harrison Ford into the megastar that we know him as today. A few years after Harrison had starred in Star Wars and he was this total A-list celebrity, he was at a Hollywood studio in one of their restaurants when one of the waiters walked over to him with the silver tray, and on this silver tray was a single business card. So Harrison reaches over, he grabs the business card, the waiter walks away, and he looks at the card, and handwritten on it is the phrase, "I missed my bet." And he flipped the card over, and it was the name of that producer from the new talent program that had called Harry into his office and said, you're never going to make it in Hollywood and you're fired. It was that guy, and he had apparently sent the waiter over to make amends because he was eating lunch in the same restaurant. And so Harrison would later say in interviews that at the time he got this card, and to this day that he was doing this interview, he said it gave him immense pleasure that when he looked up from this business card and he understood the situation, he knows this guy's in the room somewhere. As he looked around the room, he couldn't recognize the guy because he didn't know what he looked like. He was a nobody. And so instead of wasting any more time looking for this producer, he just looked at the card, chucked it, and went back to eating his lunch. On May 25th, 2012, 23-year-old Lisa Teckel, who was pregnant with her first child, sat in the passenger seat of her husband's beat-up pickup truck as he sped through the rural backroads of Agency, Iowa. Lisa and her husband Seth both had the morning off, and so they were running some errands around town. When the truck suddenly jolted over a pothole, Lisa winced and threw her hands over her belly. Seth apologized and promised to replace the shock soon, but Lisa just rolled her eyes at him. She told him it wasn't the truck, it was Seth's driving, and she joked that if their baby was going to ride with him, they'd better invest in a top-notch car seat. Lisa was 17 weeks along with a baby girl, and already she and Seth had decided to name her Zoe Maria, and Lisa had already begun saying the name out loud just to hear how it felt. As Lisa ticked off the things they still needed to buy, including a bassinet, diapers, and a stroller, Seth let out an anxious groan. Their baby wasn't even born, and she was already costing a fortune. But Lisa reminded him that they would have the money soon. After all, Seth was about to start a new job in just a couple of weeks. The new job was thanks to Lisa's dad, who worked as a deputy at the local sheriff's office and had helped to get Seth a spot at the jail. Lisa was in the same line of work herself, already working as a corrections officer at a prison in the next county over. And while being a corrections officer was not exactly exciting or glamorous to either Lisa or Seth, it was steady, and it gave both of them a real shot at eventually moving up to deputy positions down the line. And so just thinking about the job reminded Lisa that Seth still had not thanked her father yet for getting him this job. And so Lisa dialed his number, and sure enough, her dad, Todd Caldwell, picked up at the first ring. Lisa switched to speakerphone and then filled her dad in on the latest from the doctor. The baby was healthy and already fully formed with fingers, toes, and everything. She could hear the joy in her father's voice as he told them, for what had to be the 100th time, how excited he was to become a grandpa. At some point, Seth chimed in to thank him for the job, but Todd brushed it off, saying Seth had earned it. And it was true. Even though Seth was only 21, he had already gotten an associate degree in criminal justice, he'd interned with the sheriff's office, and he was a volunteer firefighter. And so, slowly but surely, he was building the resume to become a full-blown cop. Seth thanked Todd for the vote of confidence, and Lisa began to say goodbye, since they'd just arrived at their next stop. But before she could hang up, Todd told them that there was actually something serious he wanted to speak to both of them about. He said that his office was getting frequent calls from Seth and Lisa's neighbor, Brian Tate, who kept complaining, without evidence, that Seth and Lisa were vandalizing his property. Todd told them that he didn't trust the guy and that they should really just try to stay clear of him. Lisa promised her dad that she and Seth would be careful. Then she told him that she loved him and ended the call to get out of the truck. Later that evening, after hours of errands and driving around, Seth and Lisa finally reached their home, which was a quiet trailer on a wooded plot just outside of town. They finished unloading the truck, then cuddled up in bed, listening to their baby's heartbeat through a fetal Doppler monitor until they both fell asleep. At 5 a.m. the next morning, Seth was awakened by the sound of his alarm. He still had a few weeks of work left at his current job as a security guard, whereas Lisa was not working today. So Seth switched off the alarm quickly and then climbed out of bed, trying his best not to wake Lisa up. Lisa did stir a little bit, but rolled over onto her side and went back to sleep, while Seth headed down the hall to take a shower and get ready for the day. 20 minutes later, at 5:23 a.m., Deputy Martin Wunderlin with the Wapello County Sheriff's Department was on patrol when a call cracked over the radio. There had been a shooting just outside the town of Agency, and when the dispatcher relayed the address and the caller's name, Wunderlin's hands tightened on the wheel because he knew Seth Teckel. Wunderlin worked with Seth's father-in-law, Todd. Wunderlin flicked on his lights and floored it, tires kicking up dust as the cruiser tore through the early morning stillness. When he arrived at the trailer, an ambulance was already waiting outside, which meant that a paramedic had beaten him there. Otherwise, the property seemed perfectly peaceful until Wunderlin rounded the side of the trailer and saw Seth on the back porch. Seth was barefoot, shirtless, and sobbing, but the only word that Wunderlin could make out was Lisa. Wunderlin realized that whoever the shooter was, they could still be nearby. So he ran back to his cruiser, popped open the trunk, pulled out his rifle, and then charged into the trailer. The living room was dark because the blinds were still drawn, and everything looked untouched, with no obvious signs of forced entry. A rack of hunting rifles hung on the living room wall, and gleaming bowling trophies lined the shelf below. For a moment, Wunderlin remembered Lisa's father, Todd, mentioning that his daughter had at one point been a state bowling champ in high school. Wunderlin moved quietly down the hall, rifle raised, listening for any movement. He saw the bedroom door was open, so he stepped inside, and then he stopped. The bedroom walls were splashed with blood. Lisa lay motionless in the bed. Her chest had been torn open by massive gunshot wounds. The paramedic who had beaten Wunderlin to the scene crouched beside her, checking her for a pulse. He looked over at Wunderlin and shook his head. Lisa was dead, along with her unborn child. There was a pistol out on the dresser, just sitting there, but one look at it told Wunderlin that it was far too small to cause this much damage. Wunderlin backed out of the bedroom slowly and cleared the rest of the trailer one room at a time, making sure nobody else was there. Once he was sure it was empty, he returned to his cruiser and locked up his rifle in the trunk. Then he grabbed his radio, which he used to call dispatch, and he asked them to send backup. And he specified that they should notify Badge 58 right away. Badge 58 was Lisa's father, Todd. At that very moment, Todd was at home, fast asleep. He was woken by the phone, and when he answered, he heard the familiar voice of the dispatcher, and he thought it was just a work call. Then they told him that there had been a shooting, and the victim was his daughter, Lisa. Within minutes, Todd was flying across town, praying that there had been some kind of mix-up, and that Lisa was okay. But when he reached her trailer, a small crowd of deputies were scattered across the yard. When they saw Todd, they immediately moved to block his path to the front door. The deputies felt like Wonderland had made a mistake calling him here, because this was not something he needed to see. But the crowd didn't stop Todd. He pushed past his fellow officers into the trailer, and when he got to the bedroom, he took one look at his daughter and burst into tears. Todd stood in the doorway, shaking with ragged sobs. But within moments, his grief became rage, and he stormed back out of the trailer and he howled, "Go get him!" And immediately, the deputies in the yard bolted to their cruisers and started pulling out body armor and slamming magazines into rifles. In seconds, they were geared up and moving in unison toward the house immediately next door to Seth and Lisa. This house belonged to Brian Tate, who was the neighbor that kept calling Todd's office to accuse Seth and Lisa of vandalizing his property. Brian was a 57-year-old Vietnam War veteran who was known to suffer from PTSD and schizophrenia. And so now, Todd was convinced that Brian must have had something to do with his daughter's death, not only because of those calls about vandalism, but also because of something that had happened between Seth, Lisa's husband, and Brian 2 months earlier. Late one night back in March, Seth had been making his way home through the dark streets when he suddenly jammed on the brakes to avoid hitting a deer lying in the middle of the road. Seth got out and inspected the animal and confirmed that it was already dead. Clearly, someone else had hit the deer with their car and just left it there. Seth knew this deer carcass was actually pretty dangerous, and the last thing he wanted was for somebody else to come along here and either run over the deer and create a huge mess, or maybe swerve to avoid it like he had done, but run off the road onto his property. So he dragged the deer carcass to the side of the road, right on the curb, and onto what was technically the edge of Brian Tate's property, but in reality, the carcass was really basically out on the sidewalk. Then Seth got into his car and drove the very short distance to his home, thinking that was the end of it, that he had done the right thing. But that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, when Seth stepped outside, the deer had been moved from the sidewalk directly into his backyard. Seth realized that Brian must have woken up and found the carcass and been somehow mad about it and tossed it over the fence directly onto Seth's property. This was totally irritating. In Seth's mind, the deer had been hit in front of Brian's place, so really it was Brian's responsibility to deal with it. So Seth grabbed the deer carcass again, which was now noticeably smellier as it was decomposing, and hurled it back over the fence, back onto Brian's property. By the time Seth came home from work that evening, he found the deer carcass in his driveway. And so what did he do? He picked it up again, dragged it over, and tossed it over the fence onto Brian's property. And then the next day, Seth found the carcass literally zip-tied to his fence post. The deer carcass went back and forth, growing more disgusting with each pass, until it was almost falling apart. Eventually, some other animal must have dragged it off, but the feud continued. Brian began patrolling the fence at the edge of his property and would glare at Seth and Lisa whenever he saw them. He accused them of throwing rocks and beer cans at his garage, and when Seth and Lisa denied it, Brian stopped complaining to them and started calling the police instead to report them for vandalism. And then in April of 2012, so just 11 days before Lisa's murder, her father, Todd, had responded to one of those calls himself. He didn't tell Brian that he was Lisa's father or that he'd already heard all about the deer incident from Lisa. He wanted to genuinely hear Brian out and see what kind of person they were actually dealing with. And Brian had not held back. He'd led Todd around his property, pointing out rocks he swore hadn't been there before, while complaining that Seth and Lisa had committed what he called acts of terrorism against him. He even produced an old coffee can filled with dog feces that he said had been dumped on his porch and on the hood of his car. To Todd, Brian just seemed really paranoid. But as he continued ranting, Todd noticed something else. Just inside of Brian's front door, leaning casually against the wall, was clearly a shotgun. Seeing that gun made Todd nervous, so he tried to calm Brian down and assured him that Seth and Lisa were not out to get him here. He said that they were good people and would not do what he was saying they were doing. But Brian only grew more upset. And eventually, Brian just stalked off away from Todd and went inside his house, slamming the door, and that was the end of the conversation. And so from that moment on, Todd had been convinced that Brian Tate was unstable and dangerous. He had warned his daughter and Seth to steer clear, and he made sure every deputy on the force knew that if they ever got another call involving Brian Tate, they should go in expecting Brian to be the threat. So, on the morning of Lisa's murder, when 4 deputies charged up Brian Tate's driveway, they half expected him to come out shooting. But when they knocked, Brian answered the door completely unarmed, and he seemed perfectly calm. He scratched at his beard, looking around at the deputies through puffy eyes, and then asked them what was going on. The deputies traded nervous glances. They didn't want to give away their suspicions just yet, so they told Brian that unfortunately his neighbor Lisa had been found dead, and that now they were making their rounds to see if anybody had heard or seen anything unusual. Brian stared at them for a long beat, then told the deputies to wait right there. He disappeared back inside his house, then returned with a stack of plastic lawn chairs, which he set out on the lawn. And to the deputies' surprise, for the next 40 minutes, Brian fielded all their questions about everything from his whereabouts that morning to his mental state and his relationship with Seth and Lisa. He told them that he didn't know anything about what happened to Lisa and certainly hadn't heard any gunshots that morning because actually he'd been deeply asleep, sleeping off the effects of the new antipsychotic meds his doctor had him on. The deputies weren't quite sure what to make of him. Brian was surprisingly open, not defensive or jittery, but he also wasn't acting even remotely shocked by the news of Lisa's death. And some of what he said raised serious red flags. For one thing, he kept saying that none of this would have happened if the police had just taken his calls seriously, which of course really made him look quite suspicious because his calls were complaints about Seth and Lisa. And then once he brought up the vandalism, it was like no matter what the deputies asked, Brian would steer the conversation back to the vandalism. He said that before his feud with Seth and Lisa, he'd been Mr. Nice Guy. People had taken advantage of him. Now, he said he was, quote, kind of taking a different approach to life right now, being more serious and more not such a nice guy. Meanwhile, back at Seth and Lisa's trailer home, an evidence retrieval crew had arrived and was busy sweeping the area. Seth was despondent in the driveway, sobbing and punching his own truck until his knuckles bled, while Todd tried his best to calm him down. When one of the deputies swung by to say that Seth had been scheduled for an interview at the sheriff's station, nobody was surprised. Todd and Seth both understood that as Lisa's husband, Seth had to be looked at seriously as a suspect. And so Seth had no issue doing the interview and said he was just eager to get it over with. Once Seth sat down inside of the tiny interview room, he half expected to actually recognize whoever it was that came in to speak to him. After all, he was pretty well connected in town and certainly had a connection to law enforcement. However, the man who walked into the interview room was somebody Seth didn't know. He was clean-shaven and wearing a crisp suit. The man introduced himself as Detective Chris Thomas and said that he was an investigator with the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation, and he'd been sent to assist with this case. Suddenly, Seth wondered if maybe he'd made a mistake coming here without a lawyer, but Detective Thomas assured him he just needed Seth to walk him through what happened that morning. That was it. So Seth began telling the story, struggling to keep his voice level as he described waking up at 5 a.m. to get ready for work, and how he'd just gotten into the shower when he heard what sounded like a gunshot. Seth said he had jumped out of the shower right away, he had saw the front door open and ran to the bedroom where Lisa was, and he had found her still in bed, but she was moaning. Then he heard a loud thump from the back deck and realized there had to be an intruder. So he grabbed his pistol from the nightstand and raced after them. Seth told Detective Thomas that he fully intended to shoot whoever the intruder was, but when he got to the porch, they were already gone. So he ran back inside to the bedroom and discovered that Lisa was not breathing. And that's when he saw his wife's gunshot wound and realized clearly she'd been shot. He called 911, but by the time the paramedics arrived, she was already dead. As Seth finished the story, emotion overwhelmed him and he broke down. But Thomas didn't offer any comfort. Instead, he began pressing Seth about his marriage and asked if Seth and Lisa had been fighting, or if they were having money problems or extramarital affairs. Without hesitation, Seth looked up and said no, there was nothing like that. But just then, the detective's phone buzzed with an incoming text message, and when the detective glanced down at it, Seth felt a flash of panic as he wondered if maybe the text might be about him. The real reason Seth was nervous, though, is because he knew he had not been 100% honest with this detective. He did have a secret, and he knew that if it came out, it would make him look guilty and also be very embarrassing for Lisa's family. But now he realized that keeping that secret was not going to help his situation, so he decided he would split the difference. He would tell Detective Thomas some truth, the most relevant information, if you will. But he would hold back the details that would offend Lisa's father and frankly embarrass the whole family. And so before the detective could move on to any other subject, Seth said, "Hold on a minute, there was another woman. At least, sort of." For the past few months, Seth said he'd been texting with a coworker named Rachel. They'd hung out a few times after work and had even kissed a handful of times, but that was as far as it had gone. Seth had realized it was wrong and had ended things with Rachel before it turned into a full-blown affair. But Seth had barely even finished the story when Detective Thomas actually stopped him and said he knew that Seth was actually still lying. And that's when Thomas revealed that he had been receiving text messages from another team of officers who were questioning Seth's friends, and that through them, Thomas had learned that Seth kept a secret burner phone. Seth had not just been flirting with Rachel, they'd also been sending each other sexually suggestive photos as well. Seth was stunned. One, that his instinct that those text messages the detective was getting was somehow tied to him, that actually was correct. And two, he hadn't realized how quickly the people around him would talk about him. So now he realized that those minor, embarrassing details he'd hoped to keep hidden were going to make him look that much guiltier. So he changed his story for the second time, and admitted that he had held back information because he was scared of what Lisa's father, Todd, would do if he found out about the sexting. Seth still insisted that he and Rachel had never actually slept together, but he did admit that, yes, there had been racy photos exchanged. And also that no, he had not ended things with Rachel. And yes, Rachel believed Seth was going to leave Lisa to be with her. In fact, Seth admitted that he had told Rachel that Lisa was going to be packing her bags and leaving that very day. The moment the words were out of his mouth, Seth knew how bad it sounded. But by this point, he knew he really didn't have another choice. He had to say what he just said. However, he could see from Detective Thomas's face that damage had been done here. Clearly, he'd messed up by not telling them about the secret phone from the start. And now, nothing he said would sound like the truth. Meanwhile, across town, Lisa's father, Todd, still had complete faith in Seth. Todd was home, grieving with Lisa's stepmom and sisters, when the phone rang. It was Deputy Wonderland, calling with an update on Lisa's case. Wonderland started out by telling Todd that Brian Tate, the neighbor, had not been arrested yet, which to Todd was a huge, infuriating surprise. He'd been sure that by this point they would have Brian in cuffs at the station, but before Todd could say anything, Wonderland dropped even worse news. He told Todd that state investigators had taken the reins on the case, and they didn't think Brian was guilty. Instead, they were laser-focused on Seth. When Todd heard that, he did not want to believe it. He trusted Seth like his own son, whereas Brian Tate had always seemed like a ticking time bomb. And he was horrified by the thought that an outside agency was going to come in, misjudge the whole situation, and ruin Seth's life, while letting Brian walk away scot-free. But even as he was thinking that, the cop in Todd said to set his emotions aside and just let the investigation play out. In cases like this one, the husband was typically the one who did it. And as much as Todd wanted to believe this was different, he wasn't naive. And he also had complete faith in the police force. He knew that if the detectives did their job, then Brian would be exposed eventually. So he promised Wonderland that he would keep his distance from Seth for the moment and not try to interfere with the case. The truth would come out soon enough. In the days that followed, as Todd made arrangements for his daughter's funeral, he stayed in close contact with the investigation. Deputies had gone back to Brian Tate's property to ask more questions and look for evidence, but so far, nothing had come of it. As for Tate himself, he continued to be cooperative, letting them inside, showing them his extensive gun collection, and answering their questions without hesitation. As for the crime scene, there really wasn't much evidence there either. As Todd would learn from his colleagues, there were no signs of a break-in at Seth and Lisa's trailer, no strange fingerprints in the bedroom. Lisa's autopsy revealed that her killer was likely standing at the foot of the bed when they shot her, but the gun was still missing. There was only one potentially interesting piece of evidence found at the scene. Half of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich inside of a Ziploc bag had been discovered on the back porch, near the steps leading toward the woods surrounding Seth and Lisa's property. When Todd heard about the sandwich, he really doubted that it was relevant. In his estimation, Seth or Lisa had probably dropped it the day before the murder, so the fact that the investigators were focusing on it showed just how little they had to go on. But then he got word of a new discovery that immediately put the sandwich out of his mind and looked really bad for Seth. The morning after the killing, a Mossberg shotgun was discovered in the tall grass outside of Seth and Lisa's trailer. It had been sent to the lab, and testing confirmed it was a match for the deer slug that ultimately killed Lisa. Now, the shotgun was not Seth's, but it was registered to one of Seth's friends, who told detectives he had left it with Seth for safekeeping. When Todd heard this, he tried to find an explanation, some reason why Seth would have forgotten or overlooked something that important, but nothing added up. Because if this was a break-in, if someone else had come into the house to kill Lisa, why wouldn't they bring their own weapon? But Todd couldn't think of an answer, and so for the first time since his daughter's death, he actually considered the possibility that maybe he'd gotten this whole thing wrong. Maybe Brian really was innocent, and Seth was Lisa's killer. While all this was happening, Seth had been lying low at his parents' house. But 4 days after the murder, he headed to the funeral home for Lisa's visitation. Lisa's entire family was there, keeping to the opposite side of the room from where Seth was sitting. It was the first time that Seth and Todd had been in the same space since the morning of the murder, and the shift in mood was unmistakable. Todd would not speak to Seth at all, but Seth noticed he kept glancing in his direction, almost like he couldn't help himself. Seth had already been feeling isolated, but this really cut deeper. Lisa's family had always treated him like one of their own, and now they weren't even meeting his eyes. He stood to the side, unsure of what to do, until he spotted Lisa's little sister. Out of all of Lisa's family members, Seth had been closest to her. So after nervously glancing at her a few times, he got up the courage to cross the aisle and approach her directly. He didn't know how she was going to react, but he was so desperate for a connection that he just walked over, gave her a hug, and then whispered that he loved her and that she would always be his little sister. And when Lisa's little sister said she loved him too, Seth's hope bloomed. He told himself that maybe the cold shoulder he was feeling was just grief and confusion, and that maybe Lisa's family had not given up on him completely. But as the visitation ended and Seth walked out of the funeral home, a county police cruiser was waiting for him. Deputy Wonderland approached him, told Seth to turn around and put his hands behind his back. He was being charged with Lisa's murder. Seth didn't resist. He let Wonderland cuff him and lead him to the car, then just stared out the window as they pulled away from the funeral home. Lisa's family stared right back at him, and in their cold expressions, he could see their doubts hardening. The last thread had snapped. His friends, Lisa's family, the cops he'd once hoped to work alongside, none of them believed him anymore. Seth was alone. But while the state swiftly moved toward a trial against Seth, the media was not ready to let Brian Tate go as a suspect. Local journalists painted Brian as the unhinged neighbor with a stockpile of guns and a history of paranoia. Whenever Lisa's father, Todd, would read one of those stories about Brian, he found himself growing more upset about the case. At the start, he'd been sure Brian was his daughter's killer. But learning about the shotgun in the grass, and also Seth's text message affair, had really changed his mind. Now, reporters were digging up as much dirt as they could on Brian, but instead of Todd buying into them, he found himself feeling something he hadn't expected: sympathy. After all, Todd had really been the one to flag Brian early on as being unstable and potentially dangerous, and he couldn't help but feel partly responsible for the way the media was now portraying him. And these feelings of guilt only deepened when Todd learned that Brian had been involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. The details weren't public, but from what Todd heard, it seemed like the press attention had pushed an already fragile man past his breaking point. And then, on September 30th, when Brian was no longer in the psychiatric facility, he was found dead inside of his home. The autopsy ruled it was natural causes, some kind of sudden cardiac failure. But his elderly mother would tell reporters he had died of a broken heart, that the stress from the media coverage around the case had just destroyed him. And Todd agreed with her. He decided that Brian Tate had become the third victim. He was collateral damage in Seth's murder of Lisa and her unborn daughter. Now, Todd just wanted the trial to start. It finally did on February 18, 2013, almost a year after Lisa's murder. And just as Todd expected, Seth's lawyers made Brian Tate the centerpiece of their defense. But what Todd did not see coming was how much new evidence the defense had uncovered. Like the fact that just a few days before Lisa's murder, Brian's mother told a neighbor that Brian had stopped taking his medication. This was a major red flag, both because it raised the question of what mental state Brian was in on the day of the murder, and because it seemed to go directly against what Brian had told police, that he didn't hear any gunshots that morning because he was so tired and passed out from sleeping off his medication. If that story was a lie, then it suddenly became a lot easier to envision Brian breaking into Seth and Lisa's trailer in the early morning hours, grabbing a shotgun off the wall, and murdering Lisa in cold blood. But the defense did not just focus on Brian. They argued that the police investigation itself had been sloppy from the start, and pointed out everything from procedural mistakes to leads that had been completely ignored. Most importantly, neither Seth nor Brian Tate had been tested for gunshot residue, which should have been the typical procedure for this kind of shooting. No one had checked the spent shotgun shells for fingerprints either, which could have easily revealed the killer's identity. Then there was the mystery of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which still hadn't been solved. The investigators had written it off as unrelated to the case, but the defense pointed out that there was a major problem with that line of thinking. Seth and Lisa lived in a wooded area with all kinds of wildlife nearby. If that sandwich had been sitting out overnight, it likely would have been torn apart by animals by dawn. But it wasn't, which suggested it had not been there for very long. If it was dropped that morning before the police arrived, it could have only been left by Lisa's killer. Now, the sandwich itself didn't prove anyone's guilt or innocence, but the defense presented it as emblematic of all the questions that the police could not answer. It looked like the investigators just hadn't bothered to tie up loose ends because they'd made up their minds that Seth was guilty, even though there was no eyewitnesses and no DNA evidence tying him to the murder. Hearing the confusing back and forth, Todd couldn't help but worry that the justice system that both he and his daughter fervently believed in would not give him the answers he so desperately needed. As for Seth, he sat through the debate, listening to all the talk of sandwiches, gunshot residue, and Brian Tate's mental health, feeling the walls close in on him. Lisa's family was glaring at him, clearly trying to get a reaction. His friends had cut off all contact with him, and the town where he'd grown up viewed him as a killer. And so now, his fate rested with 12 strangers. As the jury deliberated, Seth braced for the worst. But when the verdict came back, it wasn't a verdict at all. One juror was holding out, refusing to convict. For Seth, this was like a gift from the heavens. One person in the world had looked at all the evidence and believed him. So the judge declared a mistrial. And then, a few months later, they were back in court. The second trial mirrored the first, with the same arguments and same witnesses. But this time, the numbers shifted. Now, 3 jurors, instead of just 1, wanted to acquit. So the second trial ended with another hung jury. Seth felt like things had to be improving for him, but his lawyers knew how close they'd come to losing. So they decided to go back to the evidence in hopes there was something they'd missed. And sure enough, they struck on something massive. Seth's lawyers discovered that in October of 2011, months before Seth and Lisa's wedding, Lisa had carried out a brief sexual relationship with a coworker named Jason. She and Jason, who was married himself, had even discussed the possibility that he might be the father of her baby. This new information gave Jason a powerful motive to want to keep his affair secret from his own wife. And, just as important, this new information showed once again that the police had screwed up. They must have seen text messages on Lisa's phone that hinted at the affair, and so their failure to properly investigate the lead was just more proof that they'd been gunning for Seth from the start and had failed to consider other possible suspects. During the third trial, Lisa's family was forced to sit and listen as Lisa's most shameful secrets were exposed in front of everyone. It was especially devastating for her father, Todd, since he'd always been close to Lisa and thought she told him everything. But not this. But the third trial wasn't over yet, and soon, one more witness was called to the stand. The court was silent as this witness took the stand and got sworn in. And as they did, the witness glanced around nervously the whole time. And from the moment the witness actually started speaking, Todd realized he finally knew, beyond a reasonable doubt, who actually killed his daughter. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Lisa Teckel on the morning of May 26, 2012. At 5 a.m. that morning, before the first rays of dawn began spilling over the trees, the killer stood outside of Seth and Lisa's trailer. They paced back and forth in the fading darkness, a cigarette trembling between their fingers. They knew they could not let this go any longer. Something had to change now. So, finally making up their mind, they tossed the cigarette, climbed the steps to the trailer, and slipped inside. The killer moved through the living room, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The shotgun was right there on the rack. They took it down, loaded it with slow, deliberate movements, and then crept toward the bedroom, where Lisa lay sleeping. The killer hesitated, reminding themselves that it was not too late to stop. They could put the gun back and walk away. Instead, they raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. As the sound rang in their ears, the killer bolted, terrified that someone had heard. They ran down the hallway, out the back door, across the porch, and into the woods behind the trailer. Breathing hard, they reached the tree line where they found a patch of tall grass and ditched the gun there. For a moment, they just stood there, doing their best to try to compose themselves. Then, at some point, they turned around, took a deep breath, and walked calmly back through the woods, climbed the porch steps, took out their phone, and dialed 911. The killer did not worry for a moment that they were actually going to get caught, because they knew exactly who to blame for the murder. If everything went as planned, the police would take the bait and never guess the truth. And it might have worked, except for one witness who came forward during Seth's third trial. The witness whose explosive testimony finally cleared away all doubts was one of Seth's friends, who admitted to vandalizing Brian Tate's property on Seth's orders. They dumped buckets of dog feces directly onto Brian's porch and also smeared them across the hood of his car. It turned out that Seth had goaded Brian into a feud that made him look crazy and dangerous. And so when Lisa wound up murdered, Seth knew that everyone would assume Brian was the killer, because Seth killed Lisa. He did it because he wanted to be with Rachel, and because, in the days leading up to the murder, Rachel had begun pulling away. And so Seth decided to murder Lisa, both so that he could be free to be with Rachel, and so that he wouldn't have to start his new life owing child support. During the third trial, the jury was as convinced as Lisa's father Todd was. And on Wednesday, July 24, 2014, they delivered a unanimous verdict. Seth was found guilty of first-degree murder and non-consensual termination of a human pregnancy, and he received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. One morning in the late 1990s, 38-year-old Sandy McKinnon hurried around her small apartment in Boston, Massachusetts, getting ready for work. She wiggled her feet into her shoes while buttoning her pants, then raced into the bathroom to do something with her hair. She looked in the mirror and sighed. Her bangs and shoulder-length hair were more tangled than she thought. She'd just bought a satin pillowcase to try to keep her hair smooth while she slept, but apparently it was not working. She got her brush out of the drawer and began to comb her hair. And as she did this, she accidentally brushed against her scalp. And as she did, she winced. A sharp, burning pain spread over the right side of her head. Confused, she parted her hair to get a good look at her scalp in the mirror, and she could see blisters right there on her head. She lifted her bangs up, and she saw the blisters extended all the way across her forehead. But as alarming as this was, Sandy thought she knew what these could be. A few years ago, she'd had a case of shingles, which caused a painful rash of red blisters, and so she wondered if maybe her shingles infection had returned. It's rare for someone as young as Sandy to get shingles, But her circumstances were special. Sandy was coming out of a difficult few years. 5 years ago, Sandy was a professional psychologist and the proud mother of 2 children. But then a painful divorce set her on a path of self-destruction. She started drinking, and then her new boyfriend got her into heroin because it helped her cope with the pain of her family splintering apart. Eventually, because of the way Sandy was living her life, she completely lost visitation rights with her kids, and then she hit rock bottom when she contracted HIV from a contaminated needle. This was a devastating wake-up call and was the push Sandy needed to leave her boyfriend and her drug habit behind. Sandy had been clean for the last 2 years and was slowly rebuilding her life. But she would always be HIV positive, and so she had to be careful. She had a weakened immune system, which is why she suffered a shingles outbreak in the first place. And so, standing there looking in the mirror at these awful new blisters, Sandy decided she would call her doctor the second she got to work, just to make sure these blisters were not a sign of anything more serious. A few days later, Sandy was running around her house again, microwaving oatmeal while pouring herself a cup of coffee. She grabbed a pill bottle from beside the coffee maker, opened it up, coaxed out a tablet, and then drank it down with a glass of water. It was the antiviral medication that her physician, Dr. John Douglas, had prescribed for her blisters. Dr. Douglas had confirmed that Sandy's rash was indeed another episode of shingles, and he told her she'd feel better in a few days with this medication. Sandy took her coffee into the bathroom and set it on the sink, and then inspected her head in the mirror. The blisters were already fading, which was a huge relief. And that sharp stab of pain she had felt right when the comb had touched her scalp that first time had subsided. But there was one weird new thing. The stabbing pain had been replaced by a persistent itch in her head that Sandy just could not seem to scratch. The previous night, she had sat in front of the TV and put a bag of frozen peas right on her head, hoping that would numb the itch and make it go away. But it didn't. And now this morning, it was still there. And so Sandy grabbed her hairbrush and began combing her hair, but as she did, she intentionally applied more pressure to try to scratch this phantom itch. And the bristles felt so good on her scalp as she did this that she lost track of time. When Sandy finally realized what time it was, she jumped. She had to go or she'd be late to work for the second time this week. Since getting clean, Sandy really prided herself on punctuality. And so despite wanting to keep trying to itch her scalp, she tossed the brush down and got going. But several days later, the itch in Sandy's head was so bad that Sandy decided to go back to Dr. Douglas's office. When she got there, Dr. Douglas parted Sandy's hair to get a better look at her scalp, while Sandy explained that when she first started taking the shingles medication, her itch had been ongoing but low grade. She could live with it. But over the last few days, the itch had changed. Now it wasn't like her scalp was itching, it was like the itch was coming from inside of her head. And so no matter how hard she tried to scratch at this thing, the burning, tingling itch would not go away. It was driving her insane. Dr. Douglas told her that itching was actually a very common symptom for all kinds of skin conditions. An allergic reaction, bacterial or fungal infection, psoriasis, sun damage, even dry skin. All of them can cause a chronic need to scratch. But Dr. Douglas told Sandy that beyond the fading shingles blisters on her head, he wasn't seeing anything abnormal on her scalp. So he wanted to try a medicated cream to try to soothe the itch and take care of any topical skin conditions that might be forming before the problem got any worse. A few weeks later, Sandy woke up a little bit before dawn. Her room was still dark, so she rolled over to go back to sleep. But her cheek landed on something that felt wet and strange. Confused, she turned on her bedside lamp and gasped in horror. Blood and hunks of hair lay scattered across her pillowcase. She instinctively reached for her head, and she felt something sticky right at the itchy spot just above her right temple. Horrified, she jumped out of bed and ran to her bathroom mirror. The itchy patch was bleeding, and the hair around that area was noticeably thin, which explained the hunks of hair on her pillow. And on top of all that, her head still itched. In fact, the itch had only gotten worse over the past few weeks, despite the medicated cream that Dr. Douglas had prescribed her. Though it was difficult, she was able to resist scratching her scalp when she was awake. But now it seemed like, in her sleep, she had somehow scratched her scalp into a bloody mess and ripped her own hair out. The very idea of her doing that made her nauseous. A few hours later, Sandy was back inside of Dr. Douglas's office, now awaiting the results of something called a viral load test, which measures the amount of HIV in the blood. Dr. Douglas was concerned that this itch she was having was a sign that her HIV could be getting worse. Dr. Douglas walked into the exam room and set his clipboard on the desk. He told Sandy that there was some good news. Her HIV was actually inactive and showed no signs of progressing. So whatever was causing this itch very likely had nothing to do with her HIV. Dr. Douglas had also ordered additional blood tests and x-rays, but those had also come back normal. Sandy felt a weight lift off her shoulders, but it was short-lived, because then Dr. Douglas delivered his diagnosis. He suspected that Sandy's itch might actually be a symptom of a psychiatric condition instead of a physical ailment. He thought she might have a condition called trichotillomania. It's an obsessive-compulsive disorder in which patients have an irresistible urge to pull their own hair out. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD for short, is when someone has unreasonable thoughts or obsessions that can lead to compulsive behavior. And so they were suggesting that Sandy had a version of that. Sandy was immediately skeptical. She told Dr. Douglas that she didn't actually have the urge to pull her hair out. She just had an itchy scalp. But Dr. Douglas still wanted to try treating her for trichotillomania. And so he prescribed her antidepressants that were used to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder. And hopefully, they would help her manage the urge to itch. Sandy still felt very unsure about this, but at this point, she was willing to try anything to save her scalp. 3 weeks later, when Sandy's alarm clock went off, she felt awful and groggy, and she slammed her hand down on it to make it quiet, and then she sat up to get out of bed, and as she did, she felt thick liquid running down her face. At first, she was worried it might be blood, and so instinctively she wiped it off her face to check. But when she looked at her hand, it was not a red, viscous liquid. It was pale green and runny. And so she went to check her itchy spot in the bathroom mirror, but when she looked, all she could see was all this gunk on her scalp, and it terrified her. Sandy grabbed some gauze from her medicine cabinet and dabbed it gently on her scalp, trying to absorb some of the greenish goo. Then she picked up the phone and called Dr. Douglas, and thankfully, he was free for an immediate appointment. Once Sandy got to his office, Dr. Douglas inspected her scalp with a flashlight. Sandy could feel him pressing around the itchy spot with gloved fingers. And then at some point, he clicked off the flashlight and promptly told Sandy that he was calling an ambulance, and then he hurried out to get her charts updated before she could ask any questions. An hour later, Sandy was in the hospital with emergency room doctors and nurses crowded all around her, prepping her for emergency surgery. Sandy was so scared, she thought she might have a heart attack. She asked one of the doctors what was going on. He looked up from what he was doing and gave Sandy an alarmingly blunt answer. He explained that she clearly had been scratching her scalp in her sleep, so much so that the raw tissue had grown infected, and that infection had softened her skull bone enough that Sandy had scratched all the way through it during the night, and she'd managed to now scratch into her brain. The greenish goo was infected cerebrospinal fluid, the doctor said. That is the liquid that cushions and protects the brain. Now they were worried that Sandy's scalp infection could reach her brain, and so they had to get her to the operating room before Sandy suffered extensive and lasting brain damage. Later that afternoon, Sandy felt lightheaded and bleary-eyed as she woke up and looked around her hospital room. The trauma of her morning came rushing back to her, and so instinctively she patted the top of her head, and she found it was wrapped in layers of gauze. Then she noticed her thigh was bandaged too. She wondered if she banged up her legs somehow. Just then, a doctor appeared at the doorway and came to her bedside. He first asked Sandy how she was feeling, and Sandy said she was really just confused and didn't know what was going on. And then the doctor explained what had just happened. They told her that a neurosurgeon had washed out Sandy's wound on her head and removed all the damaged tissue. Then a plastic surgeon had covered the wound with a graft of skin from her thigh. The entire procedure had gone well. Sandy just needed to give her body time to heal. Sandy was shocked, but thanked the doctor, and then closed her eyes, enjoying the warm, cozy hug of anesthesia. But a few minutes later, as the anesthetic began to wear off, a tiny little itch began to simmer beneath her bandages on her head.
growing sharper and wider until it was almost unbearable. Sandy gripped either side of her hospital bed, fighting the urge to scratch. She pressed the call button and then gritted her teeth until a nurse came into the room. Sandy explained the problem and pleaded for more anesthetic to curb this itch, or anything really, just to keep her from scratching her scalp. The nurse promised to see what she could do, but warned Sandy they couldn't just give out anesthetic as a painkiller. They'd have to find another way to help her. Almost a week later, a new doctor stood at Sandy's bedside. He introduced himself to her as Dr. Baker, a member of the hospital's psychiatric team. Sandy knew why he'd been called to see her. She had awoken in the hospital bed with blood covering her pillow. She'd scratched all the way through her new skin graft. So they'd taken her into surgery to give her a second one. And so now she had bandages not just on her head and right thigh, but also on her left thigh, where they pulled the second skin graft from. But by this morning, she had scratched through the second skin graft as well. Even though the hospital was wrapping her hands in gauze every night before she went to sleep to prevent her from scratching through her skin grafts, while she was sleeping, she couldn't stop herself from scratching. She could resist the urge to scratch during the day, but she became a danger to herself the moment she fell asleep. It was like instinct was taking over. Dr. Baker knew all of this and gave Sandy an encouraging smile when he saw her, but he told her that he still agreed with Dr. Douglas. She must have some form of OCD. In Sandy's case, her compulsive behavior was scratching her head. Dr. Baker told Sandy that he wanted to interview her family about her habits prior to coming to the hospital. He also wanted to give Sandy a psychiatric evaluation to confirm her diagnosis. And in the meantime, he was going to start her on drugs that would make her feel groggy and help her sleep, in the hopes that that would keep her from scratching. Sandy was resigned and just nodded and thanked Dr. Baker for his help. And then that day, she began the sleepy medication, but the next morning, she still woke up to find blood on her pillow. The medication was not stopping her from scratching while she slept. A few weeks later, a neurologist named Mary Evans stood over Sandy in her hospital room, carefully examining her wound. Dr. Evans treated diseases of the nervous system, including the brain and spinal cord. Dr. Evans knew that the hospital had already given Sandy a psychiatric evaluation and concluded that her unbearable itch was a sign of mental illness. But she also knew that the evidence they'd collected so far from family and friends made it seem very unlikely that Sandy had OCD. So the psychiatric team had called Dr. Evans from neurology to consult on Sandy's case. Dr. Evans inspected the graft over Sandy's head wound. It seemed to be healing okay. Dr. Evans took out a small aerosol can with a long red tube attached and sprayed a sharp blast of cold air onto Sandy's wound. She asked Sandy if that felt cold, but Sandy just shook her head and said no. She said she could tell that Dr. Evans had sprayed her with something, but could not feel the temperature shift. She also couldn't feel Dr. Evans' fingertips while she was patting the wound. Dr. Evans was puzzled. Sandy couldn't feel any physical sensation when someone touched her wound, and yet the wound was itchy to her. That shouldn't be possible, Dr. Evans thought, except that the doctor had actually seen this in another shingles patient a while ago. That patient was tormented by an insatiable itch over her eye. It was so bad that that patient actually scratched off her own eyebrow. Dr. Evans told Sandy that she didn't actually think she had OCD, and so she wanted to try a few other treatment options. At this point, Dr. Evans could tell that Sandy was both exhausted and deeply discouraged. She seemed desperate to relieve the itch, but also tired of being poked and prodded, and so Dr. Evans promised that these treatments would be virtually painless. Dr. Evans grabbed a syringe of local anesthetic from a metal tray near Sandy's bedside. She injected a few drops to the area around Sandy's scalp to make it numb. Within a few minutes, Sandy's eyes went wide and she grinned from ear to ear. She said the itch was gone, just like when she'd gotten out of her first skin graft. Sandy looked so happy, she seemed like she might cry. Dr. Evans returned her smile. She suspected that Sandy's itch was a physical problem, not a psychiatric one. And this little test confirmed her theory. She warned Sandy that the itch would return as soon as the anesthetic wore off. At that point, they could try an anesthetic patch, but the effects of that wouldn't last very long either. Dr. Evans wanted to try and learn more by taking a sample of the itchy skin. Hopefully, she'd be able to solve this problem once and for all. A few days later, Sandy sat up in her hospital bed, going over her biopsy results with Dr. Evans. They showed that 96% of the nerve fibers in Sandy's itchy skin patch had been destroyed. That meant Sandy shouldn't be able to feel anything around the itchy spot on her scalp. And yet, her itch was as intense as ever. And so Dr. Evans told Sandy that she was going to call a neurosurgeon to get a second opinion. A few hours later, that neurosurgeon came into Sandy's room with Dr. Evans by his side. The neurosurgeon suggested that something must have gone haywire in Sandy's nervous system, causing her to feel a phantom itch in a part of her scalp where there were virtually no nerve cells. The neurosurgeon hoped that if they cut the main sensory nerve connecting the front of Sandy's scalp to her brain, the itching sensation would go away. But Dr. Evans didn't look so sure. She worried that if they went forward with that surgery, Sandy would lose more feeling in her scalp, but potentially still have the itch. Sandy understood that this surgery was risky, but she was desperate. She told both doctors that she needed some time to think about it. And for the next 6 hours, that was all she did. She laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, weighing out her options, while simultaneously doing her best to ignore the constant, incessant itch. Sandy thought about what life would be like if she had no more feeling in a large part of her scalp and forehead, and it made her want to cry. But at the same time, she was so frustrated with this whole situation, she was going mad. It took everything, every minute of every day, to keep herself from scratching and scratching until she tore the nerve right out herself. She couldn't keep living like this. She was scared and nervous, but more than anything, she was just tired and done with this itch. And so if there was even the slightest chance that cutting that nerve would stop the itch for good, Sandy was willing to try it. A few weeks later, Sandy stood over the sink in her hospital room, getting ready for bed. After washing her face and brushing her teeth, she grabbed a bulky foam football helmet from her bedside table and put it around the gauze that was still wrapped around her head. Sandy had to wear this helmet, otherwise, she would rub her head against the pillows while she slept in an effort to scratch her scalp. She climbed into bed, and a few minutes later, a nurse came in and slipped Sandy's wrists into the padded cuffs that were now attached to rails on her bed. After she was restrained, Sandy closed her eyes, trying to get some sleep. For 2 blissful weeks following Sandy's surgery, the itch had been gone. And then it returned with a vengeance. And this time, no amount of pain medications or psychiatric suggestions could get it to subside. Even local anesthetic had stopped working. It was absolutely miserable. Sandy felt awful all the time and was depressed and felt so far from recovery. Now, the only way she could keep herself from scratching her scalp at night was to have the nurses literally bind her wrists to her bed rails. But she hated being awake 24/7 even more. She broke down crying in frustration all the time. She could hear herself growing irritable and snapping at people who didn't deserve it. She was mad at herself for her behavior, but she also just felt totally overwhelmed by the stupid itch and the thought that she might never ever be free from it. Sandy began to wonder if her first doctor had been right, that all of this was just a symptom of OCD. Maybe with the right OCD treatment, her itch would go away again. It was her last hope, because she knew she simply couldn't live another 30 or 40 years with an incessant itch driving her mad. She simply couldn't do it. Sandy began to sob. She'd been to rehab years ago to kick her heroin habit, and that experience had totally changed her life for the better. And so she decided that when she woke up in the morning, she would check herself into a different kind of hospital, a rehab hospital for psychiatric illnesses. 9 years later, in 2008, Sandy heard her doorbell ring. She slowly crossed the living room of her small apartment in Boston and checked her hair in the tiny mirror next to her front door. She opened the door and greeted her guest, a doctor and popular medical writer named Atul Gawande. Dr. Gawande was writing an article for the New Yorker magazine on the physiology of itching and was interested in Sandy's case. And when he'd called her a few weeks ago, she said she was happy to talk about it. It had been 7 years since Sandy left the locked mental ward at a Boston rehabilitation hospital. She'd spent a staggering 2 years in rehab because she was considered a danger to herself. For a while, just like at the previous hospital, they had bound her hands to her bed every night to keep her from scratching at her scalp in her sleep. It had taken months to work out a more humane system. Sandy wore her helmet to bed, along with big white mitts that the staff would fasten to her wrists. It made her feel like Toad from Super Mario Bros. But Sandy certainly did not feel at all like a video game character. The repeated injury to her brain from scratching had left her partially paralyzed, so she was confined to a wheelchair. Sandy led Dr. Gawande into the living room. He took a seat on the couch, and Sandy rolled her wheelchair right next to him, and then Dr. Gawande pulled out a tape recorder and a notebook for the interview that they'd scheduled. As they began talking, Sandy told him that even right now, her itch was bothering her, but she was coping. She found ways to distract herself, like watching her favorite TV shows and keeping up with friends over the phone. Sandy then held up one of her hands to show the doctor how short she kept her fingernails. She told him she did this so that if she did scratch her scalp during her sleep, the short nails would hopefully limit the damage. And then during the daytime, if the itch ever got really bad, she would rub it instead of scratching it, or use a soft toothbrush or towel. At this point, she said she wasn't trying to cure it, she was just trying to find a way to live with it. At the end of the interview, Dr. Gawande thanked Sandy for her candor and promised he would be in touch. He had some ideas about Sandy's condition, but he wasn't quite ready to share them. When he finally published his article, though, his theory about what was going on with Sandy was unlike anything any of Sandy's doctors had ever proposed. In Dr. Gawande's article, he suggested that Sandy's itch might be caused by a little-known condition called sensor syndrome. It's similar to phantom pain experienced by some people who have lost limbs to disease or war injuries. Just like an amputee who feels pain in a part of the limb that was removed, Dr. Gawande wondered if maybe Sandy's brain was telling her she had this itch, even though there were literally no nerves there for her to scratch. In the article, Dr. Gawande described a therapy developed by one of his colleagues to help people with this kind of problem, really specifically people who had phantom pain. The colleague, a neuroscientist, used mirrors to trick his patients' brains into resetting their sensory systems. By angling a mirror a certain way, the reflection could make it look like their missing limb was actually still there, which helped the patients rewire the way their brains processed information. In other words, the mirrors made their brains see what they needed to see to think that their arms and legs were fine. Dr. Gawande thought a similar concept could help Sandy. After speaking to Sandy and gauging her interest in potentially trying this therapy, Dr. Gawande called his colleague who did mirror therapy, and the colleague agreed that Dr. Gawande might be onto something. He suggested that maybe a pair of mirrors could be arranged in a way where Sandy's reflection wasn't reversed, so that left is right and right is left, like it is in a normal reflection. That way, when she looked into this particular mirror, the itchy side of Sandy's head wouldn't itch at all, signaling to her brain to stop scratching there. And then theoretically, over time, the itch would eventually go away. But critically, for this therapy to work, Sandy would have to know she was doing, quote, mirror therapy, but wouldn't know that the mirror was reversed. She would think it was a normal mirror. That's the only way you could actually trick her brain. Dr. Gawande's article about Sandy and the physiology of itching was published in The New Yorker and has since been reprinted over and over, giving new hope to people who suffer from this wildly frustrating condition. It's prompted many doctors to rethink the way they treat chronic itching, one of the most common symptoms in all of medicine. Unfortunately, we don't actually know whether Sandy tried mirror treatment because Dr. Gawande never found out. And so as a result, we actually don't know if she still has the itch or if it's gone away. We don't know. However, what we do know, which stems from this article and Dr. Gawande's research, is that other people who have had very similar symptoms to Sandy, these sort of chronic phantom itches, if you will, have been cured through mirror treatment.
On the evening of March 22nd, 1994, a 40-year-old, very experienced airline pilot named Andrei Danilov walked into the cockpit of a huge airplane that he was about to fly out of Moscow. Once he was in the cockpit, he said hello to the 2 other pilots he'd be flying with that night, and then Andre took a seat in the captain's chair. Now, this flight tonight was going to be a very routine 13-hour trip to Hong Kong, something Andre and these other 2 pilots had done many times before. But this night, Andre was totally dreading this trip, because one of the pilots he'd be flying with that night was a guy that Andre just could not stand. His name was Yaroslav Kudrinsky, and he was going to be the relief pilot that night. So Andre is the captain and the primary pilot. He has a co-pilot or first officer who sits right next to him, and then behind those 2 would be Yaroslav, the relief pilot, who basically is just there in case the captain or first officer needed a break. And so basically, Andre was going to be forced to interact with Yaroslav all night long. And so as passengers made their way onto the plane, and as Andre went through his pre-check procedures to get ready for this flight, Yaroslav just started yapping away about how amazing he was and what a great dad he was because he brought his kids on this flight. You know, they hadn't done a big international flight before, and so he was letting them fly with him that night. And then also Yaroslav began talking about this big surprise he had for his kids that was really going to show what an incredible father he really was. Now, Andre and the first officer were listening to Yaroslav, but they were basically just completely ignoring him. They're not responding to him, they're not feeding into what he's saying, but Yaroslav didn't care. He just kept on rambling on and on and on about how amazing he was. And so finally, Andre got clearance to take off. And so even though Yaroslav was totally annoying him, he was able to take off, and they went up to their cruising altitude, and they began making their way towards Hong Kong. And the whole time, Yaroslav's just going on and on and on. And finally, 5 hours into this trip, Yaroslav is still just going on and on and on. And Andre has just had it. He cannot stand to be around this guy anymore. And so finally, Andre turned around and just cut off Yaroslav, who was mid-sentence about some anecdote about how strong his son was and what a talented wrestler he was. And so Andre just cuts him off and is like, Yaroslav, take over. I'm taking a break. I'm going to go sleep for a bit. And so Yaroslav would stop what he was doing. He would stand up. He would take his seat in the captain's chair, and he would take over flying the plane. And so Andre got up. He left the cockpit. He went to the very back of the plane in the main cabin to this row of seats that was reserved for him and the other pilots. And he got in there, and he laid down, and he closed his eyes. But just a couple of minutes after closing his eyes, Andre began to feel the plane begin to bank hard to one side. Now, Andre couldn't really remember if this was the time they were supposed to be turning or not, but it just felt like this turn was more aggressive than anything he anticipated at any point in this journey. But Andre knew this plane was brand new, and so if there were any kind of minor mistakes that Yaroslav was making flying the plane, well, the autopilot feature, which was state-of-the-art in this plane, would easily correct those small errors and keep the plane going towards its destination. And so, even though, again, they're still in this pretty sharp turn here, Andre just closed his eyes again and tried to go to sleep. But a couple of minutes later, they were still banking, and in fact, the bank was starting to get even more aggressive, to the point where Andre opened his eyes and he's thinking to himself, what is Yaroslav doing up there? Like, we're basically going in a circle at this point. We're spiraling midair. And so right as Andre was about to get up and go see what the heck was going on, the plane began to shake really violently, and suddenly Andre realized, oh my goodness, the plane could be stalling right now. There could be a real issue in the cockpit, and this is not some minor error. And so as passengers on the plane are starting to sense that something could be wrong here, I mean, the plane is like hard to the side and shaking, so people are starting to scream and cry, people are nervous. And so Andre, he begins to stand up to go to the cockpit when suddenly the plane goes from just shaking and banking to basically rolling completely on its side. So all the windows are now on the ground and everybody's on their side. Andre knew he could not go to the cockpit. There was no way to do that. And so all he could do was just hold on to his seat and pray they got out of this. And then just as quickly as all this started, it stopped. The plane kind of went back to level, it stopped shaking, and then Andre heard the sound of the twin engines out on the wings roar as if the plane was kind of getting back up to speed, and for a second, it seemed like everything was okay. And so Andre, sensing that this was his chance to get back to the cockpit and frankly just reassume command, because whatever was going on in there, it was not okay. And so Andre, he got up and began running down the aisle to get to the cockpit. But right as he was about to grab the door, the plane suddenly tilted upward and they began rocketing up into the sky, so strong that Andre was pinned to the carpet. And so for a couple of seconds, Andre couldn't do anything, but then he began to hear the sound of the actual frame of the plane beginning to crack from all the pressure of accelerating so quickly up into the sky. And so with all of his strength, Andre reached up, he's on his hands and knees, and he grabs the door handle to the cockpit and he opens it up, and the second he looks into the cockpit, he would have known exactly what was wrong. It would turn out Yaroslav's big surprise for his kids, that he promised Andre and the first officer would demonstrate what an amazing father he was that he was going to let his kids fly the plane, just for a second. But these are untrained children that have no idea how to fly a plane. And so when Andre got up and went to go take a nap and Yaroslav took over, well, Yaroslav called up his kids who were in the main cabin, a teenage son and daughter, and they went into the cockpit and they sat down in the captain's chair and they began to fly the plane. And the daughter took the seat first in the captain's chair, and she was very careful not to touch any of the controls, even though Yaroslav was kind of encouraging her, to take the wheel and really see what it feels like. But she was nervous, and so she really didn't touch anything. But then Yaroslav's son, when he sat down in the captain's chair, he did grab the controls and he pulled on the wheel hard enough that he somehow disengaged the autopilot feature, and nobody noticed. And so as Yaroslav's son is yanking forward and backwards on the yoke, so the steering wheel of the plane began going in all these crazy directions because there was no autopilot to stop it. And by the time he had figured out what was wrong, it was too late, because the plane had entered into an unrecoverable stall and it crashed into the foothills of Siberia, killing all 75 people on board. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Back in 2018, I was very depressed. I had just left the military and I was really struggling to re-assimilate back into civilian society, and it was making me depressed. And even though I was encouraged from a young age to open up and talk about my feelings when I was feeling down, as an adult, I just couldn't do it. I felt very insecure about it and was worried if I began talking about my problems that I would be viewed as kind of a weak person, or even worse, a complainer, something I was very worried about. But eventually I would go seek out a therapist because I became so miserable and it just had to happen. And I'm so glad I did, because as soon as I actually talked to a real therapist, I saw therapy is actually kind of great. As soon as you open up and kind of unburden yourself, a trained therapist can really help you work through your issues and come to terms with them, and over time, you'll get better. And so that's why today I want to talk to you about BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. And then after filling out a brief survey online, BetterHelp will usually be able to match you with one of their licensed therapists within 24 hours. And then it's up to you how you communicate with your therapist. You can chat with your therapist on your phone, your computer, phone call, video call, messaging. It's totally up to you. So if you're struggling right now and you think therapy could help you too, think about giving BetterHelp a try. Let BetterHelp connect you with a therapist who can support you right from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallen or just click MrBallen during sign up to enjoy a special discount on your first month. On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain. And so she had gone to the doctor and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it. But despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse. She was losing weight and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, we really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at. But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, you know what? I'm taking you to the hospital. And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, we think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection. And so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is. And then hopefully we can treat it. And so Mark said, okay, that sounds great. And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room. But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home. And they would say, well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home. Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of secretly thought, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own. And now today, she's walking around on her own, trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, she's ambulatory. That's going to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m. And she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home. And the nurse said, sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now. But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second. And then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown. She pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her. Then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket. She grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway, she looks down the long side to the right, then she looks to the left, she sees the blue door, and she goes to the blue door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours, and so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower. And so they contacted Mark and they said, hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you? And Mark was like, no, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is. And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas, and they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is, until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. And he's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help. In order to explain what happened next, you need to look at this picture. So in this picture, on the right-hand side, you see there are two outdoor landings with people on them. The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits. And so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went into the stairwell and she went down one floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor. And she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you got to remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused, and she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing, and a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing. But instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, like, come check it out. And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone. And security at the hospital, who said they were going to go check, They didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn. And then finally, on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th floor, and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died, so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that landing. But it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately, Lynn's family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million. On May 28, 1986, a Florida real estate agent named Marguerite Welty walked up to the front door of this little white stucco home sitting right on the edge of Lake Placid in Florida. Marguerite pulled out a key from her pocket, she unlocked the door, opened it up, and then she turned around, and standing right in front of her were her clients, this young couple named Lois and Richard Goodman, who were thinking about buying a vacation home. And so this was one of the homes they were checking out. And so Marguerite smiled at her clients and gestured for them to come inside. The house sat at the end of a quiet, shady street lined with huge trees and other small vacation homes, and a lot of these vacation homes were perfectly manicured and beautiful, but the house they were touring today was not. It was unmaintained and overgrown, the paint was chipped and fading. It just looked bad, because the owner of this property at one time had used this house as their vacation home, but lately they had just kind of stopped coming out here, and so they really never came out to check on the property, and so it definitely had the look of an abandoned property. And now the owner didn't even know if they could fix it anymore, and so they decided they would just sell it and let somebody else deal with it. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois into the house, and she brought them right into the carpeted living room, and the house was very musky and dark. All the windows were shut and all the blinds were drawn, and so Marguerite kind of instinctively walked over to the windows and began opening up the curtains and opening up the blinds, letting sunlight into the house. And so as this room is suddenly being lit up by the sunlight, behind her, Marguerite hears Lois and Richard start to laugh at something. And so Marguerite turned around to see what was so funny, and when she saw what Lois and Richard were laughing at, Marguerite did not think it was very funny. In fact, she thought the fact that they were laughing right now was kind of rude, especially when you considered what this couple had asked of Marguerite. They had come to Marguerite and said, hey, we want to buy a vacation home. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be on the water. It needs to have this and this and this. But we have a tiny budget. Go find us homes. And so Marguerite had really struggled to find vacation homes that were in their budget, but then she had found this diamond in the rough, this house on the coast of Lake Placid. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, it had a garage, direct access to the water, it even had a boat dock. This house was perfect. Now, of course, this house had obvious downsides, like the fact that it was clearly a fixer-upper. Anybody who bought this home would have to put a lot of work into just making it livable again. And then also, there was a distinct weird vibe about the property itself. Because the owner was never there, they had covered all the furniture inside of this home with white sheets, which kind of gave it a sort of haunted house vibe. And then also, there was virtually nothing of value inside of this home, because again, the owner was like never here. But for some reason, there was this super intense security system on the house. There was cameras everywhere, and the windows had metal bars over them. And so the aesthetic inside and outside this house was not a good one. But again, Marguerite felt like if they could just look past the negative stuff, this was really the perfect place for them. But now, here Marguerite's clients were, laughing away at the kind of goofy interior of this home. It's like they were being totally disrespectful both to Marguerite and frankly to the owner of this property. This is a good opportunity. What are you doing? But ultimately, Marguerite couldn't force her clients to be appreciative of this. And so she just kind of laughed along with them, but then very quickly changed the subject and told them, hey, let's go walk around the rest of the house. Make sure you see the whole place before you pass judgment. But Marguerite only had to lead Richard and Lois around the house for a couple more minutes to figure out they definitely were not in the market for this house. They could not look past the bizarre kind of spooky almost atmosphere inside the house and how run down it was. So they were just not going to put an offer on this house, and Marguerite knew it. And so even though Marguerite was definitely frustrated, she told her clients, don't worry about it. I'll go back to the drawing board. I'll find more properties and we'll check those out. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois out of the property. She shut and locked the door behind her, and then she and her clients left. 2 days later, on May 30th, 1986, the owner of this rundown old vacation home came by to check on the property. Basically, because they were trying to sell it, they just wanted to go up and make sure there were no obviously bad things about the property. They knew it was in rough shape, but, they're just doing a sanity check. And so they get to this property, they open up the door, and they step inside, and right away, the owner is hit with this horrible smell. Now, the owner knew it normally did not smell great inside this home, but this smell he was smelling now was just so bad. It was so pungent, he knew it was not normal. And so the owner began walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell was coming from. And at some point, he found himself in the living room, and his eyes happened to land on the thing that Richard and Lois Goodman had been laughing at 2 days earlier. Except when the owner saw this thing, he didn't think it was funny at all. In fact, what he did is he instantly turned around, ran out of the house, grabbed a phone, and called 911. 4 days earlier, on May 26th, a 28-year-old man named Thomas Lopez Ruiz, who was living in this makeshift campsite down by the water near Lake Placid, he decided to leave his campsite and go into town to try to earn some money. Thomas did not have a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs in town whenever he could to earn a few bucks. But on this day, when Thomas went into town, there was no work. So Thomas decided he would go rob one of the many vacation homes along the coastline of Lake Placid. And the home that he picked is the same vacation home that Marguerite would take the Goodmans to 2 days later. And so Thomas arrives in front of this overgrown property, and he tries the doors, and they're all locked. However, Thomas had a plan. Thomas was a pretty small guy. He was about 5 foot 2 inches tall, only weighed about 140 pounds. And so he figured he could just slip through the chimney. That's how he could break into the house. And at first it went great. He slipped in no problem. And before long, he was making his way down towards the inside of the house. But what Thomas realized as he went down the chimney is the chimney was not perfectly straight up and down. Instead, it was sort of tapered, where at the top it was wide, but the deeper you got, so the farther down you went in the chimney, the narrower the inside of the chimney got. And so when Thomas was almost all the way down the chimney, he got stuck. He could not get the rest of the way down, but where he got stuck, he couldn't grab the top of the chimney. He couldn't pull himself out. And so he is absolutely wedged, can't go down, can't go up, and making matters even worse was every time he exhaled, his chest would shrink a little bit, and that would cause him to slip a little bit farther, a little bit deeper into the chimney, and then when he would try to breathe in again, his chest would not be able to fully expand again. And so basically, every second that went by, Thomas was sinking lower and lower and lower by little bits, making it harder and harder and harder to breathe. And you got to figure that he was screaming for help, which again was causing him to breathe a bunch, causing him to sink even farther. And so it would have made breathing extremely difficult. And so Thomas is like in this absolute claustrophobic nightmare. And without outside help, he had no chance of survival. 2 days later, Marguerite Welty brought the Goodmans into that property, and she would open up the blinds, and sunlight would come into the living room, and Marguerite would hear Lois and Richard laughing at something, and she would turn around, and she would see they were pointing at the fireplace, and visible in this fireplace were 2 legs dangling down inside the chimney. They were not so far down that they were touching the ground. They were just kind of suspended in the air. And Lois and Richard, based on the way the house looked already, the kind of spooky vibe, there's white sheets over all the furniture. There are these bars on all the windows. Everything is dark and dirty and kind of gross. Like there's this haunted house vibe to this place. And they're thinking, this must be a Halloween decoration or some sort of prank. A mannequin kind of jammed up into the chimney, maybe to look like a robber breaking into your house or something, that the owner never took down. Because clearly the owner stopped taking care of this property, and so it kind of makes sense that these decorations would be left out. And so Lois and Richard are laughing at this Halloween decoration, and Marguerite, she looks at the legs too, and also thinks they're just some Halloween decoration, doesn't think anything of it. And so finally they end up leaving, and that was it. But as I'm sure you all have guessed, of course those legs were not mannequin legs. Those were Thomas's legs. And in fact, the creepiest part about this is Thomas may have been alive during the house tour. The autopsy showed he actually did not die of asphyxiation, so he didn't suffocate. He died from dehydration, which takes about 2 days, and this house tour was about 2 days in. And the day prior to the house tour, a neighbor had been outside and they thought they heard someone yelling inside of the property, but for some reason, the neighbor just didn't do anything about it. And so there's a pretty good chance Thomas was barely alive as they were touring the house. But, by the time the owner came back 2 days later and smelled that horrible smell, Thomas had passed away, and that smell was the smell of his body decomposing. Also, just to close the loop on this, it's not clear why the homeowner had that really aggressive security system with the bars on the windows. He just did.
It smells like magic, cold sweat skin, I feel it coming. In the lantern glow, your eyes twitching. You came looking for truth, but you just found trouble. Your memories are cracking, and I'm chewing through the rubble. Future sight, I don't think I can save you in time. Ruined city in the moonlight, sentinel of the night.
On the morning of May 26, 1990, Marlene Warren was at home inside of her beautiful mansion in Florida when she heard a knock on the front door. Marlene was busy and was hoping that her adult son might go answer the door, but when she looked over to the living room where her son was, she saw he was laying down watching TV and didn't even seem to have heard the knock on the door. So Marlene sighed and just walked over to the front door herself and opened it up. And to her surprise, standing on the other side of the door was a person dressed up in a clown costume, holding flowers and balloons. Now, Marlene loved clowns, and she had recently celebrated her 40th birthday, so she figured this must be someone's birthday gift to her, and she was thrilled. But after the clown handed Marlene the flowers and balloons, there was this loud popping